Howdy everybody. We're going to be talking today in this 7th video in the Catholic theological tradition about a very colorful and controversial character. I'm Dr. Marcellino D Ambrosio, otherwise known as Dr. Italy, and today we move on to another of the early apologists and controversialists. Mid-2nd century, late 2nd century, early 3rd century kind of figures who had a very important role in defending the faith, but also in arguing inside the church for orthodoxy as opposed to heresy. And the reason this guy that we're going to talk about is so interesting is because he was a lawyer. Yes, a lawyer. So, you know, the lawyer jokes that abound everywhere. This guy shows the best and the worst of all the preconceived notions people have about lawyers and what they bring to the table. This guy lived in a different part of the Roman Empire. The people we've been talking about so far have been in the East. This is the first serious writer from the West, from North Africa, which had been a Roman possession since the Carthaginians had been vanquished before Christ, many years before Christ. North Africa was Latin speaking primarily, but in the cities of North Africa, the cultured people, especially Carthage, the capital, all the cultured people, like every other cultured people in the Roman world, would know Greek well and be able to read the Greek classics and write in Greek. And this man is no exception. His name is Tertullian. He's the son of a centurion. And he is a raucous pagan. He's a lawyer, but he's a womanizer. He's a man of very irritable and impatient character. He's incredibly cultured. He reads and writes perfectly, equally as well in Greek and in Latin. And he is knocked over the head by the Lord. He sees Christians martyred in the arena. He is moved somehow, and though he's an adulterer, though he's a loose liver, he comes to the catechumenate, becomes a Catholic Christian around the year 195 AD. And he's so bright that very quickly he becomes a teacher. He becomes a catechist. And preparing people for baptism, he writes the very first full treatise in our tradition on baptism. Magnificent, and teaches us, by the way, that infant baptism is part of the apostolic tradition. The thing about this man, his personality, he is an orator. Any good lawyer has to be a good orator if they're going to argue a case in front of a court. They need to be able to motivate, move people by the way they speak, and this guy's choice of words are unbelievable. He's probably, other than maybe Augustine, the pithiest, most quotable figure in the early church. Just short, pithy statements like, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What a powerful way to express contempt for philosophy and pagan learning. But he also is a guy who is writing about the persecutions of Christians and how Christians are blamed for everything, but how the pagans are barking up the wrong tree because the more they persecute us, the more we grow. He says, the blood of the martyrs, the seed of the church. And that's the kind of guy he is, very strong. Unfortunately, he's somewhat sarcastic with the pagans. He turns out being sarcastic later in his life with Orthodox Christians. In fact, he's a very controversial figure because we have about 31 treatises left from him, many more than from poor old Justin. We only have 3 from Justin. We got 31 from Tertullian. And largely, you know, that's because he's the first one to write in Latin. And after his time, the knowledge of Greek is lost in the West. And the way writings are preserved down through the ages is people copy writings that they're using. So when they're not using Greek manuscripts, they tend to fall apart and die up. No one recopies them. It's a lot of work to recopy a manuscript. So the Greek writings in the West just kind of fell by the wayside because the language of Greek was lost in the West by about 350. No one was reading and writing in Greek. Everyone was using Latin. So anyway, fortunately, Tertullian starts writing in Latin after he writes a few things in Greek. And so his corpus of this body of writings become very important and influential. He's a brilliant mind. Is he a holy man? Not so much. he has a temper. He's very irritable. He's very impatient. And he gets impatient later on with the bishops. But first, I've got to tell you about a movement that was ripping through the church at this time. It began, it seems, in the mid-2nd century. It's really picking up steam and is rather strong at the end of the 2nd century when Tertullian comes into the church. And it's called Montanism. And the reason it's called Montanism, named after its leader, Montanist was the guy's name. He's from Phrygia in Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. And Phrygia was kind of known to have a lot of crackpots in it and a lot of enthusiastic people in crazy, frenzied sects and cults. And this is kind of a frenzied Christian cult. It didn't originally say we're going to be something different from the Christian Catholic Church. No, but it began through a kind of prophecy. It was a prophetic movement. And I've got to point out that prophecy was alive in the ancient church. We see it in the book of Acts. We see the fact that there were women prophets even in Acts. According to Acts, the 4 daughters of Philip were prophetesses in the early church. So we see prophecy. Paul says, he talks about prophecy and tongues in the church. So the charisms were present in the early church. There wasn't a sense of the charisms being at odds with the institutional church. In fact, Ignatius of Antioch calls himself the God-inspired. He was considered to be a prophet. For him, prophetic teaching seemed to mean that he would know supernaturally the needs of a church before anyone told him about those needs. So his preaching was guided by the Spirit topically, in a very mysterious and supernatural way. So he was called the God-inspired. He was proud to be known as a prophet, a prophetic bishop. So there was no idea of some dichotomy between prophecy and the institutional church. But see, with the Montanists, now prophecy takes a different form. These people who say that they're prophets, Montanus and 2 women who are his chief disciples, they go into ecstatic trances. It's kind of a weird phenomenon, like they lose control and something speaks through them against their will or beyond their consciousness. That is not really traditional Christian prophecy. You see a little bit of that kind of thing in the Old Testament with the pagan prophets and maybe even a few prophets of Yahweh, but with Saul, for example. But you don't really, that's not Isaiah and Jeremiah, and that's not Elijah, and it's not part of our tradition. That's something alien. So that comes in, that crazy kind of prophecy. Now the content of the prophecy was problematic. It was end times prophecy, apocalyptic. Jesus is coming back and he's going to touch down soon right here in Phrygia. So, trying to name the time and the place and everybody get ready. There's no sense in making preparation for the future. Jesus is coming back. The kind of thing we see in certain Protestant sects. We see this in Montanism. But also, and this is really important, there is a criticism of the bishops. The bishops are soft. The bishops are not doing their job. They are promoting a lax Christianity. They're allowing people to the communion table who have no business being there. Like people who denied Christ. They can't be forgiven. Or people who surrendered the sacred books or who went along to some degree with the pagan police. I mean, the only way that you can deal with persecution is to be blatantly contrary to the authorities, and any bit of compromise in any way, shape, or form it means they can never be forgiven. So this idea of a laxness in the church, the bishops being too soft, letting people come to communion who they shouldn't. They were against second marriages. For them, it was a sin if your spouse died and you remarried. That is not allowed. So it was a rigorism, this rigorist idea, and it was also primitivist. We got to go back to the New Testament. These days, in this day and age, we've been getting too soft. We got to go back to exactly the way it's done in the New Testament. And if it's not there, we can't do it. That idea, you find it in some groups in the Christian world today. The Puritans were like that. The Church of Christ is somewhat like that today. This was an idea present in this sect, the Montanists. So they ended up breaking communion through their criticism of the bishops. The Spirit isn't in the church. They denied the Spirit. The Spirit's in us. We have the Spirit, not the bishops, not the half-baked, lukewarm congregation down the streets or go to the bishop's liturgy. So, this is a movement that is, again, destroying not so many things. A proper idea of prophecy, wrong idea about the end times, and also breaking church unity, elitism. This is the problem with Montanism. And our problem with our guy, Tertullian, is he had an irascible character. He had a rigorism, a severity about him that made this very attractive. So by about the year 205, he is writing now against the church. So some of his treatises are awesome, and some of his treatises are mixed with this Montanism, this rigorism. So you have to read him with a critical eye. But here's the thing. Some people will say he's not a father of the church, because a father of the church is somebody who is characterized by antiquity, orthodoxy, sanctity, and church approval. And this guy's not a saint. Well, you're dang right he's not a saint. However, if you use my definition of writers and teachers who helped in their teaching to transmit and to develop the apostolic heritage from 100 to 800, well, he fits like a glove, because he's a witness, very important witness, to the early church's practice of baptism and sacramental life. Invaluable. But also, he helps to develop creatively the tradition. He's the one who introduces the term in Latin, Trinity. Well, it's Trinitas, that's a Latin word, but our English translation is Trinity. That's a pretty serious introduction and contribution, wouldn't you say? He also comes up with the classic formula of one essence or one substance in three persons. Now, that is the formula that Nicaea later approves, and we use it to this day. That's a pretty serious contribution. He also identifies what becomes classic Christological terminology. How do you explain Jesus as God and man? Well, here's the way you do it. Jesus is one person, two natures. One person, two natures. Awesome. Fantastic. That is a contribution of Tertullian. So Tertullian is very, very important. And a good example of church approval for Tertullian is, of course, using this terminology. But it's also his bishop down the road after he passes. We don't know how he died. We assume he died out of full communion with the church, but we really don't know for sure. What we do know is one of the greatest Latin theologians right after him is the Bishop of Carthage. His name is Cyprian. Cyprian dies a martyr. But Cyprian every day read pages from Tertullian. He'd say to his secretary, "Bring me the master." And this, I think, is very, very important for us to understand. Just because we find value in a writer doesn't mean that that writer is perfect or is a saint. But on the other hand, those who aren't saints often can make very, very valuable contributions to God's work. God uses imperfect people. He uses sinful clergy today. He used sinful, we don't know if this guy was ordained or not. We know he was married. Some think he was a priest, we're not sure. But regardless, he was an important teacher, a catechist, and a father. And he was very flawed. So, my teacher in grad school, a monk, a Benedictine monk, who taught me the theology of the fathers, he came to class one day with a t-shirt that said on the back of the t-shirt, "Pray for Tertullian. He needs it." So pray for the repose of the soul of Tertullian and learn from him. Use critical assimilation to enjoy and savor the truth that he passes on from the apostles and the way he develops that truth to help us with some of our most important doctrinal expressions.
you.